Now, Louis Kraft has quite a record of in show business, and now his talent's carrying him into writing books and presenting one-man plays. Now, later on, I think it's in April, Jeff was telling me, Jeff Kroom and Louis Kraft are going to be appearing in Hays City, Kansas at the same time, but at different places. That's unbelievable. They all show up making presentations. But anyway, they'll tell us about this later. Louis Kraft has republished a book of his called Custer and the Cheyenne. And it was a hand-sewn book. He designed it himself, actually, and because he's such a talented artist. And he illustrated it and designed the book, and it's a magnificent book. He has it for sale here, and he'll sign it for you, I'm sure.
Actually, Dick has it for sale here.
Thank you. And I got a garage full of them. No, that's not. That's a joke. That's not.
I wish we had a garage full of them.
Anyway, Louis is. I've had dinner with Louis in his house, and he's illustrated. He's a fan, a movie buff, and he's writing a biography of Errol Flynn. He might tell you a little bit about that. In the course of writing this book about Errol Flynn, he flew over to Paris to interview Olivia de Havilland, and he went over there and was invited to her home, and he said as they sat down at the table to have lunch, when the champagne glass would take a sip out of it, somebody would appear from behind a curtain or something and fill it up again. So that's what a life that is. Anyway, so Louis is going to tell us about a new book that he's publishing, and it's coming out by the University of Oklahoma, and it's coming out soon, and he'll tell you about that, on the life of Ned Wynkoop. Anyway, I'd like to present our friend and talented author, Louis Kraft.
Thanks, Dick. And Frankie, you here? Ah!
In the flugelhorn section.
Frankie and Dick have been my friends for many, many, many years. Can everyone hear me? No? Does this thing move?
Louis, the microphone, you got to get right up close to it.
Right up close to it, okay? Love affair with microphones. I need to say something. Dick and everyone in the band, I loved it. Gary Owen, wonderful. But unless Dick said it, I asked him, I called him up on the phone and said, could you play Gary Owen? He went out and found the music. It was my request. Seventh child of a well-to-do Pennsylvania family, Edward W. Wynkoop, Ned to his friends, migrated to Kansas at the age of 20 in 1856. Typical of his times, he harbored the usual prejudices, mainly that Indians were little more than wild beasts. A harsh view, certainly when one considers that he hadn't seen a real Indian up close yet. This wouldn't happen until late 1858, when gold was discovered at the base of the Rocky Mountains. Wynkoop joined one of the first mining and land development outfits to set out for what is now the state of Colorado. He didn't eat poor low, the idealized Indian of the Eastern press. Instead, he came face to face with living, breathing warriors. These weren't men you snickered at or joked about. They were well-armed adversaries capable of killing you. The first incident happened while Wynkoop and the other would-be miners slowly made their way across the prairie. A group of Kiowa and Comanche warriors approached the caravan, and using sign language made it clear that one of the mules that the whites had belonged to them, and they wanted it back. After talking it over, the whites decided they weren't going to hand it over. The Indians pulled back, that continued to follow the caravan. While his companions fingered their weapons, Greenhorn Wynkoop wandered away from the wagon train and agreed to race one of the Kiowas. He held a slight lead when his rifle, which he held across his saddle, bounced off the pommel and discharged, the ball narrowly missing the warrior he raced. Almost immediately, the rest of the warriors surrounded Wynkoop, yelling at him and waving their weapons in his face. Nervous, he looked back toward his friends. Instead of charging to his rescue, they frantically circled the wagons. Wynkoop thought he was a goner. But instead of demanding he die, the Kiowa he raced assured the other warriors that the white men had meant him no harm. That evening, Wynkoop and his companions spent a long, long night holding their weapons and peering out into the blackness. Nothing happened. And in the morning, they discovered that the Indians had left. Wynkoop's second experience took place in late 1858 when he and a fellow named Albert Steinberger set out from the shanty town that would eventually become the city of Denver. Braving the dead of winter, they rode to Upton, the first capital of Kansas Territory, to file a land claim for the Denver Town Company. Just before they reached Grand Island in present-day Nebraska, a band of Pawnees detained them. Wynkoop called them friendly Pawnees. Using a half-breed interpreter, the Indians demanded to know the whereabouts of their tribal enemies, as if Wynkoop would know. While they made their demands, they helped themselves to the white men's supplies. After taking all they wanted, they rode off, all except for one, and followed the two white men. By this time, Wynkoop could see the town in the distance. When the warrior came close enough to attempt to communicate, Wynkoop struck him across the face with his whip. He and Steinberger then dashed to Grand Island in safety. They reached their destination in early January without further incident. 5 years passed. 1863 arrived, and Wynkoop, now a major in the 1st Colorado Volunteer Cavalry, commanded Camp Well just outside of Denver, Colorado Territory. Even though his Indian experiences were long gone, he would soon find himself involved in an Indian uprising. That August, the Utes began raiding the settlements, and Wynkoop received orders to track them down and destroy them. Before he found a trail, he heard that negotiations ended the uprising. Colonel John Shivington, who commanded the military district of Colorado, ordered him to return to Camp Well. However, before Wynkoop reached his post, he learned that a Ute war party ran off some livestock. Unsure what he should do, he left his command and forced march to Denver to meet with Shivington, who ordered him to retrieve the livestock. If this proved impossible, Shivington wanted him to attack. Before setting out, Wynkoop gave an interview. I intend to penetrate to the villages and hiding places of the red thieves and murderers and administer a lesson that the survivors will not soon forget, he said. The newly labeled Indian fighter hustled back to his command and resumed the hunt. He followed a fleeing and unseen foe through the mountains of portions of Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and had almost reached New Mexico when, on low supplies and his men and livestock worn out, he called off the hunt and limped back to Camp Weld. During the entire campaign, Wynkoop never saw a warring Indian. Surprisingly, his failure to engage the enemy didn't tarnish his Indian fighting reputation. By the following spring, Wynkoop commanded Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado. Beginning in April, tensions between the races began to accelerate. Attacks, killings by both white troops and Indian war parties just escalated as the months moved towards summer. By August, whites living in the territory lived in fear. That same August, Wynkoop reported to Shivington, "I intend to kill all Indians I come across until I receive orders to the contrary." He didn't bother to differentiate between warlike and peaceful. He intended to kill all Indians. On September 3rd, some of his troops who were heading to Denver to muster out of the military came across 3 Sesitas, as the Southern Cheyennes call themselves, since they carried a letter that Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle had dictated to 2 half Cheyennes, George Bent and Edmund Gourrier. Actually, there were 2 letters. They decided to return to Fort Lyon. At first, Wynkoop was angry that his men didn't kill the Indians. Then he read the letter and realized that Black Kettle wanted to discuss ending the war and had 7 white women and children he would free. With thoughts of freeing prisoners and ending the war, he led 127 men out of Fort Lyon on September 6th. 4 days later, he closed on the Bend of Timbers, which is just inside Kansas on the Smoky Hill River. A battle line of perhaps 600 warriors confronted him. While his subordinates damned him for making the blunder of a lifetime, everybody was going to die. Wynkoop yelled for his men to form their own battle line. But the Indians didn't charge. No one died. And the next day, Wynkoop met Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders in council. He may have sidestepped the fire when he faced the battle line, but now he found himself front and center of a bitter hatred directed directly at him. Angry headmen cursed him and threatened him. Dog Soldier Chief Bull Bear charged him and demanded he stand while he berated him. His interpreter John Smith heard words that frightened him and he clammed up, forcing Wynkoop to use the half Cheyenne George Bent, who then lived with the Sesitas, to interpret for him. Somehow he kept his cool and survived the ordeal. Somehow he dealt with the people who despised the battle. The spider hated white men. Somehow he said words that the headmen at least half-heartedly believed. When Wynkoop set out from Fort Lyon, he acted on his own hook. And now, without orders, which he made clear to the tribesmen, he invited them to Denver to talk about ending the war. 2 days later, the Indians accepted his offer, and Wynkoop returned to Fort Lyon with 7 Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs and 4 white children. In Denver, he struggled to convince the governor of the territory, John Evans, to meet with the Indians. You see, Evans had his own problem. Ever since the war began to escalate in April, the Southern Cheyennes and their allies began cutting off the roads, virtually cutting off Denver from civilization. He had began petitioning for a volunteer regiment to fight Indians. In August, he got his wish, and the 3rd Colorado Volunteer Cavalry was enlisted for the sole purpose of fighting Indians. There was only one caveat: they had 100 days. It was now late September, and their enlistment was almost half over, and they had yet to engage the enemy. Evans needed them to draw blood before the war ended. Somehow, Wynkoop's words, combined with an article that William Byers published in his paper, the Rocky Mountain News, won out. And Evans and Shivington met the Indian leaders at Camp Weld on September 28. Wynkoop, the Indians, and the Rocky Mountain News walked away from the council thinking that peace had returned to the land, while Evans and Shivington strode off with just the opposite understanding. Believing that he could feed and protect these Indians, Wynkoop returned to Fort Lyon, even though no official word arrived that the war had ended. Peace seemed to come to southeastern Colorado. Wynkoop even began to view himself as a peacemaker. Still, he couldn't quite forget his past and reported to Shivington that he could annihilate the Indians camped near the fort. These were the Arapahos. The Cheyennes were camped a little farther away. Then in early November, Major Scott Anthony, 1st Colorado Volunteer Cavalry, replaced Wynkoop in command at Fort Lyon. Ordered to report to Kansas, where he anticipated facing charges of being absent from his post in time of war, Wynkoop made a point of introducing Anthony to the Indian leaders. Anthony's orders were, do not deal with the Indians. Somehow Wynkoop won out, and Anthony said he would follow what Wynkoop was doing, was basically feeding the Indians as prisoners of war. However, he made a few demands. One, the Indians couldn't enter the fort. They had to surrender any weapons and livestock they stole from whites. And he wanted them to move farther away from the fort. The Indians did hand over a token amount of broken weapons and broken down livestock, but that was it. Many of the Cheyennes and some of the Arapahoes moved to a place called Sand Creek, about 35 miles northeast of the fort. On November 26th, Wynkoop set out for Kansas. And 2 days later, Shivington, with a combined force of 1st and 3rd Colorado Volunteers, arrived at Fort Lyon and sealed it off. He met with Anthony, who was all for Shivington arriving, and also Wynkoop's subordinates. After telling them what he intended to do, he picked up 3 more companies of the 1st Colorado and set out for Sand Creek, attacking at dawn the next day, November 29. While word of the victory swept eastward, Wynkoop struggled to defend his actions. Then in late December, he received letters from 2 of his subordinates who had been at Sand Creek, Captain Silas Soule and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. I tell you, Ned, it was difficult to see children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized, Soule wrote. A woman was cut open and a child taken out of her and scalped. White antelope and others had ears and privates cut off. Squaw snatches were cut out for trophies. You would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did there. Days later, Kramer confirmed Soule writing of similar atrocities. Soule and Kramer's words rocked Wynkoop to his very being. He exploded with rage, damning the attack. His superiors listened to him. All charges were dropped, and Wynkoop was ordered to resume command at Fort Lyon and report on the attack. By this time, late December, the Cheyennes, the Dog Soldiers, the Lakotas, and the Arapahoes were amassing to begin a war of vengeance against the Vejo. This would begin in January. Wynkoop returned to Fort Lyon on January 15th, and by February, he realized that he was center stage of a potential powder keg. The war was raging all around him, and committees in Washington, D.C. and in Colorado began to investigate the attack and tarnish the victory. The Rocky Mountain News did an about-face. Without actually saying it, they implied that they had always stood for war. At this time, they began to tear into anybody who spoke out against Sand Creek. Realizing this, Wynkoop remained as quiet as possible. And for the most part, he succeeded until April of 1865, when he learned that Lieutenant Harry Richmond, 3rd Colorado Volunteer Cavalry, had personally killed and scalped 3 women and 5 children prisoners while they were screaming for mercy. Wynkoop couldn't restrain himself and spoke up. He wanted all honest men to hound this cold-blooded, dastardly murderer through the world. His stance turned him into a pariah. To complicate matters, Wynkoop felt guilty, for he had no desire to again deal with Indians. The military had other ideas, and when the government announced a peace council on the Little Arkansas River in Kansas in October 1865, the military assigned Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Ned Wynkoop to escort the peace commissioners. instead of an arrow in his back as he anticipated. Black Kettle absolved him of any wrongdoing, but it would not be so with all Cheyennes. Still, this marked a turning point in Wynkoop's life, for now he realized that he could work with Indians. And for the next 3 years he did. First on detached duty from the military, then as special Indian agent, and finally as U.S. Indian agent. In December, the military placed Wynkoop on detached duty, and he reported directly to James Harlan, Commissioner of Indian Affairs. His duties: move among southern tribes and get them to sign the updated 1865 treaty. You see, Congress argued over the treaty and began changing it, which meant that he needed to not only secure the signatures of the few chiefs, there were only a handful there that had signed the paper, but he also needed to secure the signatures of others, more important, more powerful people, such as Stone Forehead, Southern Cheyenne mystic, and perhaps the most powerful man on the Southern Plains at this time, Bull Bear, Tall Bull, Dog Soldier chiefs. In late February, he traveled to Bluff Creek, Kansas, to meet with the Southern Cheyennes and Dog Soldiers. He was set to talk to them about the treaty on March 1. However, before the council began, he learned that a Dog Soldier chief named Porcupine Bear blamed him for the death of loved ones at Sand Creek. The Dog Soldier said that if any Cheyennes touched this updated treaty, he would kill Wynkoop. No fool, Wynkoop instructed his brother George, who had accompanied him on the trip, to hide in a tent with a rifle at the ready. Wynkoop spoke to the Indian leaders. His words went out. They agreed to sign the treaty. However, they warned Black Kettle that if the treaty proved false, they'd kill his pony herd. When it was time to sign the treaty, Porcupine Bear leaped to his feet. Without enough time to signal his brother, Wynkoop began to yank out his revolver. But instead of charging Wynkoop, the Dog Soldier stormed to the treaty paper and made his X. Luckily, his movements were so stark, everyone's eyes were on him, and the Cheyennes didn't notice Wynkoop's hasty reaction. By July of 1866, Wynkoop had decided that he wanted to work for the Interior Department, and on the 11th, he resigned his commission from the military. For the next 2 months, he worked as a special commissioner, a special officer for the Interior Department. His duties: move among the Cheyennes in Kansas, soothe frayed tempers, and feed hungry people. On September 20th, President Andrew Johnson named Wynkoop U.S. Indian Agent of the Upper Arkansas Agency. He set up his headquarters at Fort Larned, Kansas. His wards included the Plains or Kiowa Apaches, the Arapahoes, and the Southern Cheyennes, which also included the Dog Soldiers. By the end of 1866, violence seemed to reduce somewhat, but tensions remained strong moving into 1867 as the whites continued to flood into the area. In the spring, Major General Winfield S. Hancock, commander of the Department of the Missouri, organized a military force of 1,400 men. His goal: to meet with the southern tribes, that included the Comanches, the Kiowas, the Plains Apaches, the Arapahoes, and the Cheyennes. He needed to impress upon them the might of the United States. In other words, the Indians would do as told or face the consequences. In mid-April, per Hancock's request and Wynkoop sending out runners, Southern Cheyennes, Dog Soldiers, and Lakotas came into Fort Larned to meet with Hancock. Hancock strong-armed them, threatening them. He then told the Indian leaders that he intended to move to their village, which was on the Pawnee Fork, about 31 miles distant. Dog Soldier Chief Tall Bull said to Hancock, "There's nothing you can say to us there that you can't say here." Hancock told him, "We're going to your village tomorrow." After the council ended, Tall Bull took Wynkoop aside and said, "Look, my people fear none of Sand Creek. Stop the soldier chief from coming to our village." Later that night, Wynkoop met with Hancock, but the general refused to listen. setting out the next morning. The following day, just before noon, Hancock's army climbed a slight hill. By the way, that hill is still there. Down below in the valley, they saw a battle line of perhaps 300 warriors. As the military prepared for battle, Wynkoop rode to Hancock and asked permission to ride between the lines. Permission granted. Wynkoop rode down to talk with the agitated Indian leaders, and this included the Southern Cheyenne war leader, Roman Nose, who often rode with the dog soldiers. They agreed to meet with Hancock, but again the general refused to listen and continued on to the village, reaching it later that day. Frightened women and children began to flee, and then under the cover of darkness, the Cheyennes and Lakotas fled. As soon as Hancock became aware that the Indians were running, he ordered Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, 7th U.S. Cavalry, to surround and capture the village. Custer did. But it was deserted except for a handful of Indians, including a little girl, somewhere between the ages of 8 and 12. She was white, half-breed, pure Cheyenne, depending upon which report you read. She had been raped many times. Hancock agreed with Wynkoop that she was Cheyenne, but only Wynkoop dared to say that the military raped her. The military said that the Indians raped her. Wynkoop said, well, if this is true, it's the first instance I've ever heard of. The press agreed with the military and launched a campaign against Wynkoop that he didn't know what he was doing. And worse, he was a liar. Hancock was angry. As far as he was concerned, these Indians were guilty. They wouldn't have run if they weren't guilty. He declared he was going to destroy the village as punishment. He sent Custer in pursuit, but Custer never had a chance because the Indians broke into little groups and scattered every which way across the prairie. On the 17th, Custer came across Lookout Station. The workers, the employees, had been brutally murdered, tortured. The station was destroyed. He sent a report to Hancock stating that the fleeing Indians were guilty of the murders. Hancock again said he was going to destroy the village, and Wynkoop told him, you do this, you will start a war. On the 19th, Custer changed his mind and sent a second report stating that the fleeing Indians couldn't have performed these murders. But it was too late. On the 19th, Hancock burned the village and started a war. This would be a costly war, very few Indians killed, almost $2 million spent. The press fried the military. Needing to end everything, the government called for another peace council. This time at Medicine Lodge Creek in Kansas. Wynkoop arrived at the council grounds early. By this time, there were over 2,000 Indians there, Kiowas, Plains Apaches, Comanches, Arapahoes, but only 25 lodges of Cheyennes, and those belonged to Black Kettle's band. The rest of the Cheyennes were down south on the Cimarron River. Stone Forehead had announced that they needed to renew their sacred arrows, and they could not listen to the vejo until the ceremony had been performed. One day before the council began, Wynkoop ate with his boss, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Thomas Murphy, George Bent, who would soon become one of his employees, and Black Kettle. Unknown to Wynkoop, Roman Nose and a war party slipped into the encampment. Since Wynkoop had made first contact between the Indians and the military on the Pawnee Fork, Roman Nose blamed him for the destruction of their homes. He intended to kill the agent. Luckily for Wynkoop, some Arapahoes learned what was happening and warned him, and he fled on horseback to Fort Larned. His timing couldn't have been better, for the peace commissioners had just arrived at the fort, and he accompanied them back to the council grounds. The Cheyennes still hadn't arrived, and the commissioners began discussing the treaty terms with the Apaches, the Kiowas, and the Comanches. On the evening of October 17, the commissioners called Wynkoop before them to explain the reasons for the recent war. Wynkoop pointed his finger at the government, saying that they failed to deliver all the weapons and annuities they promised in 1865. That the supplies the Indians did receive were inferior and that they were overcharged for them. And finally, that Hancock's overbearing, superior attitude scared the hell out of the Indians. He then returned to the little girl in the Pawnee Fork. She had since died at Fort Dodge with no additional fanfare or lamenting. Wynkoop again said that the soldiers had raped her. This initiated a new wave of outrage. Colonel A.J. Smith, 7th U.S. Cavalry, who had been on the Pawnee Fork, wanted Wynkoop fired, as did Kansas Governor Samuel Crawford. On the 21st, the Kiowas, Arapahoes, and Apaches signed their treaties. Still, there was no sign of the Cheyennes. Although, on various nights, various Dog Soldier and Cheyenne leaders would ride into the encampment just to see what was going on. Days passed. The Arapahoes, who were closely aligned with Cheyennes, were getting antsy. They wanted their gifts. They wanted to sign the treaty. They waited. Finally, on the 27th, word arrived that the Cheyennes were coming. Dust billowed ominously to the south. Suddenly, Cheyenne warriors exploded out of the trees, singing, shouting, yelling, firing their weapons. People on the village site weren't sure what was going to happen. The Indians weren't attacking. It was the moon of the changing season. The Secetas had renewed their sacred arrows, and now they were ready to hear what the veil had to say. That night, the commissioners interviewed a Dog Soldier chief named Gray Head to find out what had happened at the Pawnee Fork. After talking about it, he returned to the little girl. He knew her. He had watched her grow up. When Hancock's army arrived and she refused to leave, he said his people couldn't wait for her to change her mind. He said he was the last to leave the village and that she wasn't harmed when he left. Wynkoop remained a liar. The next day, the council continued. The Arapahoes signed their treaty. Cheyennes listened. They didn't understand everything. Actually, everything wasn't even read to them. But they got the gist of what was happening. The Vejo wanted them to live in Indian territory, current-day Oklahoma, and live in white man houses. They didn't want to do this. Besides, that land belonged to the Kiowas and the Comanches. When it was time to sign the treaty, no Cheyennes stood. Senator John Henderson of Missouri told the Cheyennes that they could hunt buffalo north of the Arkansas River for as long as there were buffalo. There would always be buffalo, the Indians thought. This was exactly what they wanted to hear. That meant they could remain in their land between the Platte and Arkansas rivers. They got the bonus that the government was going to give them annuities and weapons. They signed the treaty. As it had happened in 1865, Congress again argued over the treaty. Again changing it, which meant Wynkoop would again have to go into the field and secure new signatures. Congress didn't ratify the treaty until 9 months later. It was a cold winter and many Cheyennes starved. By the springtime, the warriors, the young men, were getting agitated. They understood that the whites wanted them to keep away from their roads, away from their towns. They were not to kill, rape, or steal from the whites. However, the treaty didn't say anything about making war against tribal enemies. In June, an aborted raid against Cause led to returning Dog Soldier and Southern Cheyennes to destroy some crops, steal some livestock, kill some livestock, frighten some whites, but no one died. The Interior Department immediately ordered Wynkoop not to hand out any weapons for the next distribution, which also happened in June. Cheyennes were angry that they didn't receive any weapons, but they took their annuities. Wynkoop campaigned for the release of the weapons and failed. In July, when he delivered annuities to the Cheyennes and they realized there were no weapons, they refused the shipment. Wynkoop increased his request for the freeing of the weapons, and his superiors gave in. And on August 9th, Wynkoop distributed weapons and annuities to the Cheyennes. The next day, a war party of Southern Cheyennes and dog soldiers who had not attended the council, but that didn't matter anyway. They were going to raid the Pawnees. However, as they arrived on the Saline River, something happened. They started attacking whites, killing whites. This continued on up to the Solomon River. These attacks, rapes, murders, initiated yet another war. This 1868 war cut Wynkoop off from his wards, unsure what he could do. In October, he applied for a leave of absence. He stated that he needed to visit his ailing mother in Pennsylvania, but he didn't travel to see her. Instead, he made a beeline for the east. He was hoping to secure some support to end the war. He failed, but some of his words again saw print. Major Joel Elliott, 7th U.S. Cavalry, read Wynkoop's latest comments in the press. Fed up with the ancient stand for Indians, Elliott declared that he would rough up Wynkoop in good style when next they met. That same October, Major General Sherman, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army, demanded that the Interior Department shut down Wynkoop's agency at Fort Larned and order him to Indian Territory to congregate his wards at Fort Cobb. Wynkoop cut short his leave and returned to the frontier. However, while en route to Fort Cobb on November 29th, he resigned his commission in protest of the war, saying, "I most certainly refuse to again be the instrument of the murder of innocent women and children." Unbeknownst to Wynkoop, Custer and 7th Cavalry followed the trail of a war party that led to a snowbound village on the Washita River in Indian Territory. Custer attacked on November 27, at dawn on November 27. To Custer's credit, when he realized that some soldiers were killing women and children indiscriminately, he moved quickly to stop the outrage. As it turned out, the 7th attacked Black Kettle's Cheyenne village. Well, Custer's report stated that 103 warriors, including Black Kettle, and some women and children died during the assault. Wynkoop had it on good authority that the Indian dead at the Washita consisted of no more than 20 men, while the bodies of 40 women and children littered the frozen ground. Wynkoop never feared the consequences of his words, and again he spoke out. This time before a standing room crowd only at the Cooper Union in New York City on the evening of December 23rd. He again pointed his finger at the government, saying that they failed to keep their promises with the Indians. Again, his comments initiated a new wave of outrage in the press, especially on the frontier. Generals Hancock, Sheridan, and Sherman all stood firmly behind Custer's victory. Wynkoop's conscience refused to allow him to accept the military's decision of waging all-out war. I do not know whether the government desires to look at this affair in a humane light or not, he said. And if it only desires to know whether it was right or wrong, I must emphatically pronounce it wrong and disgraceful. With the changing of the guard, as Andrew Johnson's lame duck administration limped toward its conclusion, Wynkoop made a good choice to become superintendent of Indian affairs. His understanding of and sympathy for the Indians guaranteed he would work for their well-being. But he never had a chance at securing the position. Incoming President Ulysses S. Grant sealed his fate. Announcing his new peace policy, Grant had no intention of allowing the firebrand Wynkoop to infiltrate his Quaker administration that would now oversee the Indians' future. Wynkoop's life on the frontier had gone full cycle. A man of his times, he had harbored the usual prejudices, but contrary to many of his contemporaries, he had an open mind and was able to accept Indians as human beings. When people he thought were at peace were brutally attacked and killed, he dared to speak out against what he thought was wrong, and by so doing, laid the groundwork for him walking a lonely trail between the races. This stance he took in 1864 has guaranteed his legacy. A legacy that George Ben understood. Ned Wynkoop, Ben said, was the best friend the Cheyennes and Arapahoes ever had. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Before I open up to questions, I would like to point out my good friend Fabio Duarte, who kindly brought his camera. He is the designer of my website, that's lewiscraft.com. He does great work. I have a technology consultancy, and if any of you need a website in the future, I highly recommend him. A few words about some things. The Wynkoop book, which is called Ned Wynkoop, Walking Between the Races, is still in process. I'm working very closely with my editor-in-chief, that's Chuck Rankin at Oklahoma. It won't be out until the fall of 2009. The rest of this year is going to be dealing with Wynkoop. I'm rewriting the one-man show on him. It goes to the Washington battlefield for 2 performances at the 140th anniversary of the battle. It's going to take place in It's going to take place in December, not November. There'll be a congressional committee there. There'll be Indians there. I'm also giving a talk on Wynkoop. There are 2 more talks I have in Kansas in May, on the 27th and 29th. Unfortunately, the Fort Lauderdale conference that was going to be on April 26th has been canceled. I have a full-length play that deals with race relations entitled Cheyenne Blood. It will premiere at Oxnard, California for a 6-week run in 2009. Are there any questions? My kind of people.
What is
Thank you. Oh, here's a question.
what is dog soldier? What is that?
A dog soldier, they began as one of the 6 Cheyenne warrior societies. But in 1856, they broke away from the Southern tribe, creating what was actually 3 distinct divisions within the tribe. The Southern Cheyennes, or the Seceches, the dog soldiers, and the Northern Cheyennes, the Cheyenne. They acted basically as a base for any warrior willing to fight white aggression. Any warrior, Arapaho, Southern Cheyenne, Lakota, it didn't matter. They were aggressive. Yes, ma'am.
Will there be any Custer people at the reenactment at Washita?
Well, the Washita is, Custer has a big part there. I don't know who the other speakers are yet. I would hope so.
Excuse me, your session at Oxnard, is that going to be at the college or what?
No, it's going to be at the Elite Theater.
The Elite Theater.
Yes, it's listed on my website. It's listed as the first show of the season. It's not going to be the first show because, unfortunately, all the usual suspects will be in the play, including Wynkoop, which means I'll be in it. But I have an engagement. I have to be away during that first run, so it's going to be one of the later
Okay.
places in the season. Any other questions?
When
Yes,
is
sir.
your book about Errol Flynn coming out?
That's a while yet. The reason being is I have this book on Wynkoop with Oklahoma. I'm under contract with Oklahoma for the follow-up book. That book will be on Sand Creek. Hopefully the Flynn book will come at that time afterwards. Any other questions?
Well, thank you so much, Louis, We'll look forward to this new book from the University of Oklahoma.
Since we finally found the music after 150 years or whatever it is, let's play Carry On.